Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Atif Mia. I'm a professor here at Princeton. I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. This is our 13th annual conference, so we're quite happy to have made it this far, and very happy to have the speakers and the guests that we have for this conference, which will be today and also tomorrow. Just some quick housekeeping notes first. Everybody is invited to a reception after our keynote speech, which will be in the atrium, just sort of downstairs. And then after the reception, those of you who have signed up for the dinner afterwards, please collect your badges as you walk out from this side after the keynote speech. So you will have your name tags, and behind the name tag will be the table number where you're sitting for the dinner. So those are the housekeeping notes, and tomorrow we start in the same room here for the rest of the conference. I just want to give you a quick overview of sort of the thought behind the theme of the conference, which is long-run macrofinance. There are some basic trends that are quite visible to anyone looking at macro and financial data. The decline in long-term interest rates over the last 40, 50 years or so, the rise in debt, both in the private sector, in the household sector, as well as in government debt, the buildup of balance sheets, central banks around the world, particularly the developed world. And so the question we want to pose is, how do we understand these movements? What are some of the forces behind these long-run trends in macro and finance? And what are some of the policy implications for these long-run trends, both from a fiscal perspective, from a monetary perspective, but also we want to focus on the supply side of the economy as well. So in particular, one other relevant trend in the long run is that despite the falling interest rates and the sort of the rising valuations in stock markets and beyond, we have not seen as much investment that you might have wished, both again in the private sector as well as in the public sector. So we'll talk about the supply side consequences of these longer term trends as well, and again, more from the policy perspective of what we may be able to do or what could have been done. So that's the broad perspective. Those are the questions we will be sort of thinking about starting tonight and then continuing tomorrow. I'll now give the floor to my colleague, Gianluca Violante, who will introduce our first keynote speaker. Gianluca.
Thank you, Atif, and welcome everyone. So I have the pleasure to introduce Lisa Cook, our keynote speaker today, and also to moderate the conversation with the audience that will follow her speech. So Lisa, as you all know, is currently a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. She was appointed in 2022 by President Biden, who recently renewed her appointment for another 2 years. Lisa is the first black woman to sit on the board, 108 years since its creation, so surely long overdue, a historical milestone for the Fed. Let me tell you a little bit about the path that led Lisa to such a distinguished office. After her first BA from Spelman College, Lisa won one of the prestigious Marshall Scholarships to study at Oxford, UK, where she obtained a second BA in the much revered PPE program, the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. You probably know that an astonishing number of prime ministers from Britain have that degree from Oxford, so much so that some have called it the degree that rules Britain. After this overseas experience, Lisa enrolled in the PhD program at UC Berkeley, where she graduated in 1997, like me, we're same year as me, under the supervision of, among others, Barry Eichengreen and David Romer. And her dissertation focused on a really fascinating topic, I think, the functioning of credit markets in Russia in the period of the transition from the Soviet socialist regime to the market economy, where credit market played, for the first time, perhaps in Russia, a really fundamental role in channeling and allocating resources towards productive uses. Since then, Lisa's career has developed and blossomed at the intersection of academia and policy. After being on the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, she spent time as a research fellow at Hoover until she joined Michigan State University, where prior to the board appointment, she was professor of economics and international affairs. On the policy side, her experience is really multifaceted. She served as a senior advisor in the Treasury in the Office of International Affairs. She advised the governments of Nigeria and Rwanda, and she also served as a senior economist on the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. But even though her policy work must have kept her quite busy, she never abandoned research. And after her dissertation, she continued to pursue her research in emerging market economies, growth, and development. But she also developed a parallel research agenda on segregation and inequality. In fact, from my perspective, some of her most original and fascinating work combines these two lines of investigation to reflect on the potential creativity gains that societies can realize by broadening participation in the innovation process, especially with respect to race and gender. It's therefore, I think, abundantly clear that Lisa, through her knowledge and experience, can offer a really unique perspective on the design monetary policy, on the implications for the economy, and the impact the monetary policy has on lives of people. And on this note, I leave the floor to Lisa.
Thank you, Gianluca, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Let me begin by recognizing the Department of Economics at Princeton for its history of nurturing and supporting scholars in reaching their full potential. Some of my most important transformative conversations I've had in my career have happened on this campus and with economists making significant contributions to the field. Let me start with the last time I was here. When I was a postdoc at Stanford, I emailed Alan Kruger out of the blue and attached an early version of a new paper asking him if he would meet me for an hour to discuss it. Because of his experience with large data sets and his curiosity, thoughtfulness, and generosity, 1 hour turned into 3. And he brought along a new assistant professor, Dean Carlin. Not only did I learn a tremendous amount from Alan during that encounter, almost 10 years later, I learned even more from him working as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors when Alan was chair. It is a great legacy of your department that you provided the conditions and support for Alan to make his seminal contributions to economics. I think similar conditions were in place at Princeton to allow Sir Arthur Lewis, the only person of African descent to receive the Nobel Prize in Economics, to be productive and thrive. While I never met him, Sir Arthur has been an inspiration throughout my career, and I am grateful for his contributions that were aided by Princeton. And you will hear tomorrow from another extraordinary person who personifies the contributions to the economics profession and personal inspiration in the field and in policymaking, in the fields of macroeconomics and economic history, and in policymaking, Ben Bernanke. The good work here continues with the subject at hand today. The focus of this conference on macrofinance in the long run provides a good opportunity to reflect on what has changed and what has not changed since the onset of the pandemic 4 years ago. A feature of the past few years has been heightened uncertainty about how the economy would emerge from the turmoil of the pandemic and the subsequent recovery. I will talk about some types of uncertainty I see as having diminished recently and others that remain elevated. Then I will conclude with a discussion of my views on current monetary policy. When the global pandemic hit in the spring of 2020, economies around the world shut down or sharply limited activity, especially for in-person services. Policymakers took action to support incomes and limit the scarring from those temporary shutdowns. During the post-pandemic recovery in 2021 and 2022, as strong aggregate demand met still constrained supply, inflation in many economies rose to levels not seen in decades. Uncertainty about the future course of inflation in the supply side of the economy was high, both in the short run and in the longer run. Would supply remain persistently depressed because of scarring from the pandemic? Would inflation become stuck well above the Fed's 2% target or even continue to rise? Recent developments appear to have narrowed the range of uncertainty about the inflation outlook. After rising to more than 7% in mid-2022, 12-month inflation in the Personal Consumption Expenditures PCE price index fell to 2.6% in December. Core PCE inflation, excluding food and energy, fell to 2.9%, its first reading below 3% since early 2021. Inflation data over the second half of the last year were even more favorable, with core PCE inflation averaging less than 2%. The disinflationary process has been and may continue to be bumpy and uneven, as highlighted by last week's reports on the Consumer Price Index and the Producer Price Index. But a forecast of 12-month PCE inflation converging to our 2% target over time still seems reasonable as a baseline outlook. Housing services inflation, which rose sharply in 2021 and 2022, should continue to decline this year as the slowing observed in rent increases on new leases passes into the official statistics. Inflation in core services ex housing, a broad category that includes items such as restaurant meals, car insurance, healthcare, hotel rooms, and airfares, slowed over the course of the last year and should continue to ease over time as consumers increasingly resist price increases and as firms' labor costs grow most slowly. Finally, with supply chains largely back to normal and goods prices declining over the second half of last year, core goods inflation looks likely to converge to its modestly negative pre-pandemic trend. However, the sharper declines in some goods prices in recent months, such as for used cars, may not be repeated. The behavior of inflation expectations helps underpin my growing confidence that inflation will continue to ease. Long-term inflation expectations remained well anchored during the period of high inflation. For example, consumers' expectations of inflation 5 to 10 years ahead in the University of Michigan survey rose only modestly, staying within the range of the previous 20 years. Moreover, consumers' expectations of inflation 1 year ahead, which rose sharply with actual inflation, have returned to near their pre-pandemic levels in both the Michigan survey and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York survey of consumer expectations. Similarly, the Atlanta Fed survey shows that business expectations of 1 year unit cost increases fell to 2.3% in February from a high of 3.8% in March 2022. A strong supply-side recovery has contributed importantly to recent disinflation. Global supply chains have largely recovered from the bottlenecks experienced in 2021 and 2022, with a return to long-run average levels of indicators such as the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. Goods demand has moderated in response to both higher interest rates and a shift in demand away from goods and back toward services. This moderation, coupled with greater supply, partly in response to higher prices, has allowed supply chains to heal. Labor supply has also recovered strongly. A rebound in immigration from lows reached during the pandemic boosted growth in the working age population. And labor force participation for workers between 25 and 54 years old rose above its pre-pandemic level. The rise was especially sizable for women in this age range, whose participation rates recently reached all-time highs, perhaps boosted by the increased flexibility associated with working from home. The shift toward at-home work has been especially pronounced for women, 41% of whom work from home on an average workday in 2022 compared to 25% in the period 2017 to 2018. It is still an open question whether this shift will be a persistent feature of the post-pandemic economy and whether it can continue to boost women's labor supply. Overall, demand and supply in the labor market appear to have come into better alignment over the past year after 2 years of considerable upheaval. A range of indicators suggests continued strength in the labor market, but also areas worth monitoring for softening demand. The signs of strength include an unemployment rate of 3.7%, up only modestly from the multi-decade low reached last year. After slowing through much of the past year, payroll growth rebounded in December and January. Employment growth also broadened in the most recent months after having been concentrated in healthcare, state and local government, and leisure and hospitality, all of which had been playing catch-up. Other indicators point to a normalizing labor market. Job openings are well above the levels of a year ago, though they remain well above pre-pandemic levels. Hiring has slowed appreciably in the job openings and labor turnover survey, JOLTS, and other surveys. Quits, which were very elevated in 2021 and 2022, have fallen below pre-pandemic levels. Data from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta show that the wage growth differential between job switchers and those staying in their jobs has narrowed. More comprehensive measures of wage growth show gradual cooling. Notably, the employment cost index for the private sector rose 4.1% on a 12-month basis in December, down from 5.1% over the previous 12 months. At the same time, layoffs and claims for unemployment insurance remain low, implying that the slowing in labor demand thus far has been along the hiring margin. One area of uncertainty worth watching is whether greater moderation in labor demand could eventually cause firms to react on the layoff margin, which would likely lead to much more pronounced rises in unemployment than we have seen so far. Economic activity, especially consumer spending, proved more resilient than expected last year. Real gross domestic product grew more than 3% on a four-quarter basis, with personal consumption expenditures accounting for over half that growth. Consumer spending generally has continued to show strong momentum in recent months. This broad resilience in the face of the sharp rise in interest rates since spring 2022 raises some questions. Why has growth remained robust in the face of a sharp tightening of monetary policy? Has the relationship between monetary policy and the economy fundamentally changed? To be sure, higher interest rates have reduced demand in some interest-sensitive sectors, such as housing, durable goods, and business investment in equipment and intangible capital. But the effects of those higher rates have been muted by the ability of many homeowners and firms to lock in low interest rates for longer terms before rates rose. Moreover, there has been pent-up demand in some sectors, such as motor vehicles, where supply was previously constrained by shortages of intermediate inputs, including computer chips. Yet over time, these forces supporting demand are waning. New firms and many smaller firms face higher interest rates, as do established firms that need to refinance their debt. Interest rates on auto loans at about 10% for new cars and 14% for used cars are beginning to constrain demand for motor vehicles, while auto production has recovered to pre-pandemic levels as supply bottlenecks have eased. Labor income growth was a significant support for consumer spending last year. Nonetheless, although the employment-to-population ratio at 60.2 is just below its post-pandemic high, average hours worked have fallen back to normal levels and wage growth has slowed. Thus, growth in total labor income has slowed to near the pre-pandemic rate of about 5% a year, which should contribute to moderating consumption. In addition, consumer spending growth may face increasing headwinds from deteriorating household balance sheets. Savings built up during the pandemic are diminishing, especially those with low or moderate incomes. Some measures of credit use, such as credit card and buy now, pay later use, and the share of households carrying a credit balance have risen above their pre-pandemic levels. And delinquencies on auto loans and credit cards, which fell to near record lows during the pandemic, have risen back to near their long-run averages. Thus, although the consumer has been surprisingly resilient, there are reasons to expect some moderation going forward. I will now turn to sources of uncertainty about the long run. While the resolution of global supply bottlenecks has played a substantial role over the past year in easing inflation and supporting economic activity, it is likely that the post-pandemic world could be characterized by greater volatility of supply. Russia's war on Ukraine and the ongoing turmoil in the Middle East have highlighted the salience of geopolitical risks to global supply chains. Most recently, threats to shipping in the Red Sea have forced vessels to take longer routes, raising shipping costs and leading to some temporary production stoppages in Europe when key inputs were delayed. While we have not yet seen anything near the widespread supply bottlenecks of 2021 and 2022, there's potential for these risks to affect supply more than they have so far. Climate change may also pose increasing challenges for global supply chains. For example, low water levels related to drought and high heat have disrupted shipping along key routes such as the Panama Canal and the Rhine River. This combination of geopolitical considerations and a more general desire to strengthen supply chains that appeared fragile during the pandemic have led to discussions of deglobalization, reduced international trade, reshoring, bringing production home, or friendshoring, which would reorient trade around the blocks of friendly countries. Such a reduction and reorienting of trade could reverse some of the persistent decline in goods prices that was seen over the last 2 decades preceding the pandemic. Some shifts in trade patterns were already apparent. At the aggregate level, the share of trade in global GDP has flattened in recent years, following a sustained increase. And there has been a dramatic reallocation in U.S.-China trade following the tariffs imposed by the two countries beginning in 2018. To gain a greater understanding of the potential effects of deglobalization, it is often useful to conduct analysis using more granular data, rather than just looking at the economy in the aggregate. Use of product country-level data on trade flows, for example, has highlighted implications of the U.S. shift away from Chinese imports in recent years, including the potential for higher import prices. Moreover, firm-level data have been used to examine how factors like supply chain shocks and trade policy uncertainty affect the resilience of long-term relationships between importers and exporters. Substantial additional work will be needed to understand the implications of any move toward deglobalization for the U.S. economy. Another long-run uncertainty concerns productivity growth and whether the strong performance in recent quarters will persist. Productivity growth is a key factor in the health of the overall economy and in our daily lives. Ultimately, it is the single most important determinant of improvements in living standards. If productivity growth remains strong, a faster pace of economic growth need not be inflationary. Productivity is usually volatile and has been especially so since the pandemic. Nonetheless, an important part of the strong supply response last year was labor productivity growth at a robust 2.7%. Various possible explanations for the recent strong productivity performance are the following. Strong demand and labor shortages may have spurred productive business investment and reorganization. The labor market churn during the recovery may have moved workers to higher paying, more productive jobs. To some extent, it could be continued labor market normalization, with reduced churn allowing workers to gain experience in their current jobs. Will the recent productivity surge continue? The rise in new businesses since the pandemic may increase innovation over time. For instance, Klenow and Lee 2020 found that new and young firms account for half of all productivity growth, despite accounting for only 1/5 of workers. Looking ahead, I see artificial intelligence as a potentially significant source of productivity growth, but that will take time. History shows that the journey from invention to general-purpose technologies to innovation to productivity can be long and uneven. Although adoption of generative AI is happening at a rapid clip, the full benefit of a technology requires complementary investments, as well as changes in corporate structure, management practices, and worker training. In the long run, productivity growth benefits from both sides of the Federal Reserve's dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment. Price stability reduces uncertainty And a strong labor market creates incentives for investment in productive capital and human resources. Given the disinflation and labor market normalization I have described, I believe the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals are moving into better balance after being weighted toward excessive inflation. When considering appropriate monetary policy, I now see two-sided risks. I am now weighing the possibility of easing policy too soon and letting inflation stay persistently high versus easing policy too late and causing unnecessary harm to the economy. I intend to closely monitor incoming data to determine whether the disinflation process is continuing and to observe the effects on the economy of the Federal Open Market Committee's, FOMC's, previous policy tightening. I believe our monetary policy stance is restrictive, putting significant downward pressure on aggregate demand. The question we face is, how do we calibrate policy to balance the two-sided risks? I would like to have greater confidence that inflation is converging to 2% before beginning to cut the policy rate. I would see an eventual rate cut as adjusting policy to reflect a shifting balance of risks. When the FOMC raised the policy rate to its current level last July, the risk of inflation remaining above 3% for some time was quite salient. Since then, inflation has fallen more quickly than anticipated, and the risk of persistently high inflation, though it has not disappeared, appears to have diminished. At some point, as we gain greater confidence that disinflation is ongoing and sustainable, that changing outlook will warrant a change in the policy rate. Restrictive monetary policy and favorable supply developments this past year have put us in a good position to achieve both sides of the FOMC's mandate. We should continue to move carefully as we receive more data, maintaining the degree of policy restriction needed to sustainably restore price stability while keeping the economy on a good path. Thank you.
One of the key features of the post-pandemic recovery was the stubbornly tight labor market that we had for a number of years until very recently. So, in fact, some of the recent empirical work by David Autor and co-authors has documented a wage compression over the past 4 years that has reversed over 1/3 of the rise in wage inequality that occurred over the past 3 or 4 decades, which is really remarkable. I mean, of course, it might turn out to be all transitory, and that the secular forces that led to the rise in inequality are the ones that are going to prevail eventually. But I like to take this remarkable fact as a point of departure to ask you a broader question about the relationship between the conduct of monetary policy and sort of inequality distributional concerns. To put things in context, my own take is that there are maybe at least 2 dimensions relevant to this relation. The first one is the transmission mechanism. So the fact that the moment we start incorporating and thinking about the fact that income and wealth inequality are very unevenly distributed in the population, that kind of changes the way we think about the propagation mechanism of monetary policy. The second one is more directly distributional welfare concerns. I remember there was a nice speech by Mario Draghi a few years ago where he talked about sort of two effects. We call them macroeconomic effect and the financial effects on inequality. By macroeconomic effects, it means that when the central bank cuts interest rates, there's an increase in aggregate demand, increase in demand for labor, and job creation that tends to favor the less disadvantaged groups mostly. The financial effect is the fact that as interest rates get cut, asset prices tend to grow, and that tends to favor the wealthy households, wealthy families. So it's a complex relationship that between monetary policy and inequality. What are your broad thoughts on it?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I think that the Fed has a role to play, but a limited role to play with respect to inequality. That would take a whole host of policies across government agencies to minimize inequality in society, but we have a limited role. But there are some places where we have some role. For example, in fair lending policies, right? We supervise financial institutions. We're not the only ones, but we are some of the supervisors of financial institutions, and we have to enforce federal fair lending laws that prohibit discrimination, and certainly that can be an impediment to wealth equality. We also believe, and I think a stronger point is that investing in a strong economy is the best thing that the Federal Reserve can do to bring people, bring marginalized groups into the economy. And we saw that before the pandemic. A strong economy attracted marginalized people into the economy where they may not have been attracted otherwise. So that's the main thing that we can do, is to use our tools to support a strong economy to address inequality.
Thanks. So related to the connection between monetary policy, inequality, and labor markets, one of the novelties of the strategic monetary policy review of 2019 and 20 was the redefinition of the second pillar of the Fed's mind, the maximum employment, into was defined as broad-based and inclusive, a broad and inclusive goal. So for those of you who are not familiar with the process, what happens is that many Federal Reserve officials, they travel through the country to organize so-called Fed Listens events, in which they could learn more about how monetary policy affected the life of the daily life of people. And one of the realization was that in low-income communities in particular, the perception was that the Fed had a perhaps narrow, or even, you may say, biased view of what maximum employment meant. What is less clear is what it really means in practice, this broad-based and inclusive goal. So one interpretation that I've seen, and that some of the academic papers take the interpretation, is that the Fed would allow the economy to run hotter for longer periods of time during recoveries. And the logic there is that when labor market gains accrue to people, the gains sort of trickle down from the top. At the beginning, they start accruing. In the beginning of the recovery, they start accruing to high earners, and then it takes time for these gains to really crystallize at the bottom of the distribution. The other view that you can take about what this reinterpretation means in practice is that the key object is no longer, say, average aggregate unemployment, but it's more like unemployment below the median, or perhaps like paying much more closer attention to, say, labor force participation. After all, half of the hires at any point in time in the economy, they come from non-participation. They don't come from unemployment. And in particular, the hires of lower skilled workers, they come directly from non-participation. So what is the right way you think of thinking? Give us some insights about the way we as economists, we should model the new mandate.
I think this is an excellent question. And we look at a broad range of indicators to understand maximum employment. So it's not just one. It's not just the unemployment rate. It's not just labor force participation. It's not just the employment to population ratio. It's also having to do with wage increases, for example, and how wages are faring. But definitely a broad range, a much broader range than I thought before I got to the Fed. So I think that there's a lot of attention paid to this. But I'll go back to a point that I was making in response to the earlier question. There's a lot of investment put in supporting a strong economy so that vulnerable workers can go from non-participation into participation, that we can see greater employment by people who were marginally attached, for example, to the economy. So a strong economy is definitely, I think, a focus of our tools, using our tools. But there's one thing that I wanted to read to you that stems from the consensus statement first issued in 2012. And it emphasized that assessments of maximum employment are necessarily uncertain and subject to revision. So we're taking that, we're taking that on. But that's why you consult a lot of them, and you consult them frequently. The committee considers a wide range of indicators in making these assessments. And this is something that I think was heightened by the pandemic. Certainly when this was happening in 2012, it was not predicted that there would be a pandemic, and the need to possibly use new indicators of maximum employment. But we use a broad range, and I think that's warranted.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's also it also makes sense because as the structure of the economy changes, sometimes it changes suddenly.
Yeah.
As we've seen in the pandemic, it's useful to look at a broader range.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so let me wrap up this set of questions with sort of what I think is a kind of a natural sequitur here. Mm-hmm. So we talked about inequality, we talked about redistribution, concern of central bankers. Another, you may call it politically charged issue that is sort of gaining momentum in central banks is climate change and the environment. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, you talked about this in your speech. So I think if you take this sort of broadly, there are two views on whether the Fed should expand its concerns. Mm. The first one is it's that it is a dangerous mission creep, and because the key about central bank credibility is really rules and commitment, and if the central bank starts incorporating in their thinking and their objective, say that the hot topic of the day, they will lose reputation and they will mostly lose the focus on their main goal, which is always price stability. The counter argument, one may say, is that it's really unavoidable for an institution that is so central, a key in the life of people, in the everyday life of people, like a central bank, to look like it is in touch with the real world, right? So in some sense, you can reverse the logic and say that in order to maintain independence, the central bank must face these new challenges because if it took a different position, sort of very hands-off position, saying, we don't want to worry about inequality. We're not worried about inequality. We're not worried about climate change. The risk is that there will be so much backlash that the politicians might take over and change explicitly the mandate, which in my view would be even worse. That's my own view. So how do you feel about this trade-off, about the incorporating new objective? What is the sweet spot there between maintaining focus but at the same time being looking kind of in touch with the with reality and the new concerns that are emerging in society, the new big questions in society?
Right, definitely a great question too. So, I think the most straightforward answer is that we have a dual mandate that Congress has given us, and that's what we have to execute. And until it changes that, we don't have the mandate to do other things. Now, I would argue that the mandate is growing in other countries and in other regions, right? So those who just had inflation as their mandate, those are moving to having maximum employment, taking into account maximum employment either informally or formally. They're adopting legislation to do that. So I think we're where most countries and areas are moving to. So I just gave a speech at the Joint Center on the origins of the dual mandate, the addition of, and it's not that old. It's since the 1970s that we've had maximum employment as another mandate. But I think most economies are moving in our direction, and until we get different marching orders from the Congress, we can't do much more. Now, I'd like to add one thing. If climate affects financial stability, for example, the portfolios of financial institutions, we have to look at that just like we look at every other kind of risk that affects financial stability. So I think that may be a way that that these might be incorporated, but just like other factors that might affect financial stability, and financial stability is one of our responsibilities, not our a part of our mandate.
Okay. So always sort of as factors that affect the way in which you sort of perform and implement your main mandate.
Yes, exactly, exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, so I think we can start taking some questions from the audience. Otherwise, I can keep asking questions. Yeah, there's.
Governor, in your early part of your speech, you've mentioned or kind of maybe raised the question of how rate is affecting economic activity, your rate decision and your rate path. And the moderator had mentioned about the, the correlation there. And if we look back, after 500 basis point of rate hikes, economy did not break. And if we look further back, after GFC, after so many cuts, the economy didn't really gain any traction, and we were worrying about deflation. So my question is there a change in the transmission mechanism or the effectiveness of rate decision on the economy? And if that's the case, how much longer do you have to wait before you realize that the economy really needs a rate cut because of a delay or the lagging effect? And my second question is, talking about dual mandate, inherently there are some conflict between inflation and employment rate or unemployment rate. I'm kind of curious, where are we on the spectrum? You mentioned about balanced risk, but at some point, is it necessary to take action for one against the other?
Shall we take maybe a couple of more questions?
Yeah. So you have a dual mandate. If all the economic indicators indicate that you should raise interest rates, but the political situation said that would be catastrophic, what would your reaction be?
Do we want to take more?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
What is the role of communication, and should it be directed at the general public, or should it be directed at sort of experts in the field?
I want to revisit the inequality issue and the 2% inflation. Coming from what I would call the poor side of the railroad tracks in America, it would seem that 2% inflation means that there's an enormous amount of the population whose income increases have to remain at very low levels. And how much, have you ever thought about how much this contributes to more human conflict over time? And I don't know if anyone would disagree that we've had a rising level of human conflict globally. And I'm CEO of a public company that manages a lot of risk, and our largest risk we consider is human conflict. So we're looking for places where this conflict could evolve over the next decade. So back to the 2% inflation target, do you have any thoughts around that? To realize that target, does it increase more income inequality? And will that inequality ultimately lead to more human conflict? And this income inequality is a global issue, it's not just in the U.S.
Thanks. I had a question related to productivity growth and the conduct of monetary policy, especially thinking about monetary policy being more restrictive than at least the Great Moderation period. I think there was a paper presented at Jackson Hole about how R&D spending investments will likely decrease when you have positive monetary policy shocks.
So I'll start with yours. We have a dual mandate that is stable prices and maximum employment, and political considerations are not part of that mandate. And I value significantly, having lived in countries where central banks were not independent, I value the independence of our central bank greatly, and every American should. And we don't take into account political considerations. Let's see, I'm going
The
to...
communication was a...
Communication?
Communication.
So were you asking, let me make sure I understood what you were asking. Are we trying to communicate to experts, or were we trying to communicate to the American public?
When you release a statement, who is the intended audience, and is that going to be going forward?
So I haven't been here that long. And I'm still, in all honesty, I'm still figuring this out. But what we'd like to do is to communicate to the entire public what we're thinking, how our decisions are made, and to the extent we can, where policy might be going. Certainly, we understand that uncertainty can be a bad thing for policy making. We'd like to minimize it to the greatest extent we can. But I would say it's certainly not just for experts. But of course, that's an argument for taking more economics courses and becoming an economics major, or maybe be doing a PhD in economics, or coming to work for the Fed. You know.
So I think we're sort of maybe talking about the same paper by Euro and Ma.
Right.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So for those of you who are maybe less familiar with this work, she and co-authors they documented that transient changes in monetary policy can have a very long-run effect on the economy through essentially the innovation channel. This is also consistent with other work by Jordan, Taylor, and others, who show that monetary policy can have effect up to a decade or longer on the economy. So this is what economists call sometimes called hysteresis. So small shocks, transitory shocks, they leave a very long-lived footprint on the economy. And here's the idea: is that if you raise interest rates, there are a lot of very interest rate sensitive firms, for example, young firms, which tend to be many of which are very innovative. I guess we have Ben Bernanke here that taught us a lot about credit constraints and the importance of credit for investment and innovation. And so this sort of changes a little bit the perspective of monetary policy, because the mainstream view of monetary policy is that as transient effects that die out basically very quickly. But there seems to be growing evidence that instead this effect could be much longer and persistent.
So certainly the hysteresis argument is something I'm aware of, and this is something that for all traditional macro models, we have to look at them and then ask whether they apply in the current situation. And I think that thinking about hysteresis is one of the things that we're doing. We're asking whether many different factors are persistent. Do we have, for example, a permanent shock with respect to work from home? I think that's a big one. But with respect to productivity growth, I think you can also look at it in different ways. If you followed me on Twitter when I could post on Twitter before I got to the Fed, you probably saw that I was quite worried about funding smaller firms, because those are the most innovative firms, and I was wondering how they would get these PPP loans. Now, they were able to access them in the second round, but it's innovation that I was concerned about, the channel of innovation, small firms' innovation leading to productivity growth, leading into dissemination of ideas and to productivity growth. And I would say that that's still a concern, but I would be careful. Many firms have a lot of cash, and firms, especially small firms, are not that different from small businesses. Typically, loans are taken out by the founders, by the owners, And if they are sitting on a lot of cash given to them as a result of fiscal policy, then we may not have the same effects that one would typically see on R&D, on R&D spending. So we have to be very careful about what may have existed pre-pandemic, what exists now, and that's what I was saying in my speech too, that we have this change in productivity growth, and we don't know if it's going to be sustained. But I think it's absolutely important to understand. And you had a question about our 2% target. And I would certainly agree with you that inequality is a problem everywhere, but I haven't seen the analysis that would suggest that getting to 2% is would increase inequality. Now, I would argue the opposite. Having a strong economy with low inflation invites people into the economy and to employment who may not have had that opportunity otherwise. I would also argue that it invites an investment and it invites innovation. And that's where you might see greater equality rather than greater inequality. But it's a problem everywhere. I would completely agree. And as I was saying initially, that it wouldn't just be the Fed. The Fed doesn't have the tools to address by itself inequality. But it has some other tools, like implementing fair lending laws, along with other agencies that are charged with supervision.
Thank you for your remarks. So my question relates to following the height of the pandemic, when the Fed started to target interest rate increases. There was a lot of concern, outside of the U.S., primarily in a lot of developing countries that had taken on sovereign debt that was often denominated in U.S. dollars, about what the effects of rate increases would have on their debt sustainability and issues related to that. So, notwithstanding, the Fed's, strict mandate, is there typically any room for considering some of these spillovers in, in your decision making and planning it as well? So.
Governor, thank you very much for these great insights you shared. If you can you share with us your outlook on financial stability, which is one of the responsibilities, as you mentioned, and we've had some wobbles, let's call it that, in recent times. So how do you see the situation? Thank you.
With respect to your question about debt sustainability of other countries, and more broadly, how we incorporate other countries in our analysis, as you said, our mandate has to do with the U.S. economy. But it is huge, and it depends a lot on what happens elsewhere. So they take into account, let's say, the European Union or Europe, the Euro area will take into account what happens with U.S. interest rates, and we have to take into account the reaction to what we do. But our focus is on the U.S. economy delivering stable prices and maximum employment for the U.S. economy. That's where, once again, the Fed may not have the tools and the mandate, but other parts of the U.S. government may. And that's where they might be more concerned, or they might be more outwardly concerned. We would be concerned too, but we don't have the tools to address that as much. With respect to financial stability, I certainly think the financial system in the U.S. is still resilient and well capitalized. And I think that our review of what happened with SVB was unflinching, and there's more work to do. And we are working hard at that every day, from the supervision side, Vice Chair Barr, and from my side, from the Financial Stability Committee side. We're working on that every day. Certainly, there are some surprises that shouldn't have been surprises, and we're trying to minimize the number of surprises. But I still think the U.S. financial system is strong and resilient.
So how does the Fed view cryptocurrencies, institutional adoption, and its effects on stability right now in the market, along with euphoria in the equity markets post-NVIDIA? Thank you.
That's a lot in one question. It's like we can just focus on NVIDIA and it's beating expectations today, right? I mean, about cryptocurrency, certainly the Fed, like other regulatory agencies, is open to innovation. Now, that innovation has to be subject to financial stability concerns and responsibilities. So we're not vying to be the primary regulator with respect to crypto, but certainly through our supervision responsibilities, we have to make sure that there are sound controls with respect to any part of the portfolio, any part of the financial institution's portfolio. So of course we're attuned to this, but we consider this one more innovation that deserves close monitoring.
All right, I think we should wrap it up. If you have other questions, you perhaps have the opportunity to ask Lisa during the reception. I just want to conclude on a lighter note here. So each one of us has their own story about how they became an economist. Mine is that I had a wonderful high school teacher who taught us Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, and I fell in love with economics. Now, on Lisa's Wikipedia page, I read that she decided to become an economist after a climbing trip on Mount Kilimanjaro with another economist.
Yes.
So it must have been an enlightening experience. So it's a true story, so we definitely want to know more about it.
So here or afterwards, because I can tell it really quickly.
Yeah, please.
Okay,
please.
sure.
Yeah.
So I was finishing up my time at the University of Dakar. I had shown up at the University of Dakar in Senegal thinking that I was going to do a PhD in philosophy. And I had not lived in Africa before, and I lived in Africa, and all the questions that I had about philosophy, and I was going to study philosophy, I was studying philosophy, turned out to be economic questions. and so I spent an entire year there, like asking about trade and about development. I mean, all these economic questions. Okay, so I go to Kilimanjaro. I thought I was going to go to a museum and look at Kilimanjaro from like a glass window and have some ice cream, look at some guidebooks or something like that. Well, if you go to Kilimanjaro, you either climb the mountain or you don't, right? So like there's no ice cream, there's no like beautiful museum to look at the mountain from, another place. I know this is a very American perspective. I know that. I will claim that. But that didn't happen. So I was put together. The singletons who show up are coupled together with other people who show up as singletons. And I was paired with a Cambridge-trained economist who had a son who had just finished an ag econ program, a top one in the U.S. So he knew both sides of the Atlantic, and I had just finished my my second degree at Oxford. And he spent 5 hours convincing me that, and this, for a person who's an undergraduate, this is the best thing, like 5 hours of office hours, just walking up a hill, right? And walking to the first hut. Let me be clear, that was that is the hilly part, not the really steep part. And he was just absolutely clear and transformative in the way he thought, well, you probably need to do this, this, and this to get a PhD in economics, because what you're describing is not a PhD in philosophy. What you are describing is a set of tools that can answer questions that you're interested in and those happened to be in economics. And it was absolutely perfect. Of course, the cab that I told to meet me in 2 hours because I thought I was going to be eating ice cream and looking at a mountain for 2 hours, left me. And I had to hitchhike back to the capital city. But it was a transformative conversation. And I just figured out, like, the courses I needed to take. He was absolutely right. And I took those courses and wound up at Berkeley doing PhD in economics. It was a very circuitous, literally route. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we are delighted that he was able to convince you to become.
Yeah, me too.
All right, thank you very much, everyone, for participating.
Thank you. Thank you.